because in terms of my skills, depicting a mental image of a group, it is actually my basic skill. The larger the crowd, the easier it is to depict. So this time in the Chinese series, I will start with many elements. When you patiently and put these elements, the picture in the minds of Americans will gradually be pieced together and present the image of Chinese people in the eyes of Americans for each element of him and describe them from various aspects. This time I will talk about careers. Chinese people's occupation in America, in the United States. In fact, the earliest large-scale Chinese employment in the US was building the Pacific Railway around 1860. At that time, tens of thousands of Chinese went there for a considerable period of time after that. Chinese people were engaged in some laborious jobs. The history of the Pacific Railway should be known to everyone, and many literary works have reflected it. The death rate was about 10%. It was really the Chinese built with their blood and sweat. But soon, new cultural groups suddenly entered into this American cultural community. After that, conflicts occurred in just over 10 years. The two cultures were too different. In 1870, there was a relatively serious incident. At that time, the owner of a bar in the Chinese community was shot in the middle of the conflict. Then hundreds of white people appeared to encircle the Chinese quarter objectively. It was like a cleansing of the Chinese quarter, and 18 Chinese were killed. In history, it was also called a massacre of Chinese people. The media reported very much condemned this behavior. But in fact, in American law, in the end, the murderers were not fairly judged. This contradiction can be said to this time, presented an explosive situation, and until outside. The Chinese Exclusion Act officially rose to a social and legal level of anti-Chinese. This exclusion included several parts. It includes, first, don't come again. Second, existing repatriation, and don't come back after being repatriated. Thirdly, Chinese who remained here were restricted in their jobs. So, since the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese people's career choices were very narrow. We talked about it in the food section. Many Chinese engaged in the catering industry and other similar industries. Mining and agriculture, but the most classic one besides catering, the most common was laundry. To wash clothes, even so, it was hard. This profession was not easy because white people also do this job. For their habits, they have the conditions. They have the conditions. They can obtain some machines. You know, Chinese laundry rooms are usually manual. This might be a good thing today. Purely handmade. But at that time, Chinese laundry was inefficient at that time. That time, some decrees were issued, required Chinese laundry rooms to hang a sign saying to deliver within 8 hours. So the employment situation of Chinese in America was very bad, especially the employment of women was very low in some states, even restricted the employment of Chinese, even the employment of Chinese in the laundry industry, which added new restrictions. So such a cultural group in a completely different cultural environment grew up with difficulty doing coolie work. This is the Chinese, was the first occupation in America. Then came World War II. During World War II, because Japan invaded China and bombed Pearl Harbor. In fact, on the issue of fighting fascism, China and the US stood together, and many Chinese soldiers joined the US Army. Who joined the US Army? At that time, the Chinese Exclusion Act, there were some corrections. President Roosevelt should have said directly, this is a historic mistake, and we should correct it, but the proportion is still small because it has accumulated for decades. In fact, Chinese Americans' employment opportunities are still very narrow. After World War II, the situation changed. What changes, especially Asian Americans, Chinese Americans in the middle and good at exams and research. It can be said from the 1940s to the 1950s, which was the heyday of the McKinseyism, but it was also the time when Chinese scholars, when many talents emerged. At that time, there were several interesting laws in the US, such as rescue plans and aid plans. At that time, the Chinese students with achievements, these international students, to stay and serve the US technology sector in the aerospace and military industry. Some core breakthroughs. There were Chinese people after the 1960s. Chinese people's ability to study has become more prominent. So many Chinese people through studying achieved in the United States a relatively high-level employment. Employment in the knowledge field. Lawyers, accountants were developing in this direction. By the 70s and 80s, the impression of Chinese people in the US had changed. They were just Chinese people, mainly engaged in some manual labor. But in the 70s and 80s, it was obvious that Chinese people could study. But this impression was different from the image of Western geniuses. Teachers, professors, and researchers was not the same as their image.
Because most Chinese people are exam-oriented.
So they wearing thick lenses and a very conservative lifestyle, avoid all racial issues. It's a nerd image, to put it bluntly. In their movies and TV dramas, hey, this is what Chinese people look like. Wearing thick glasses. Sometimes they are socially awkward, but strong in learning and research ability. This image has gradually formed over time. This is the second stage. After the image of laborers, the image of researchers, and then in the 80s and 90s, we should notice this process is like this. After the 50s, due to the Cold War, the relationship between China and US. So there were few students studying in mainland China, but many from Taiwan and Hong Kong. At that time, Chinese mainly from Taiwan, and Hong Kong occupied a considerable position. After the ping-pong diplomacy, the thawing of Sonnis relations, a large number of students went. These students came out in the 90s, and they all worked in their own jobs, began to show their abilities. At this time, they became the new elite class, described the 50s and 60s. A large number of Chinese and exams, and finally became an accountants at that time, had been called super ethnic by the United States. For them, why this ethnic minority is so strong, there were many excellent talents in it. But after the 90s, it was not just about talents anymore. They entered the era represented by Silicon Valley, technology-driven and culture-driven community. What does the term new elite mean? We need to have a general idea. The word elite originated from France in the 17th century. It mainly referred to the few people, a small number of people who controlled a lot of social resources, mainly through bloodlines, families, or some industries. They have mastered a lot of social resources. Elites refer to these people. The new elite means this, just the opposite of them. What's the difference? It is driven by technology and culture. This is called the new elite by the Western society. Among this new elite group, the Chinese people appear in it. They are the representatives of the new elite. It's the characteristics of Silicon Valley. They usually practice yoga and eat organic food and like to visit exhibitions. Their main income usually comes from investing in stocks or some global economic or some dividends. Compared to the past, formed by the old elite, is very different. Among this group of people, there are many Chinese people. The Chinese in Zoom and Wang Rengson like this. These figures have formed a new image in the eyes, have formed a new image. Of course, they have some similarities. There are some similarities with the previous. We found that most of these new elites are technical talents and few management talents. At least it's disproportionate. So it still shows that they are strong in technology, strong research ability and weak leadership and so on, still with such a shadow. So as you can see until now in the American national memory, the occupational characteristics of Chinese have gone through these three stages. The process of laborers, and then the process of researchers. And now it has reached the new elite class. Such a process, so these images are superimposed together.
Come on. Do math.
In Silicon Valley, Americans are not rich. Chinese in Silicon Valley are rich. In the American national memory, Chinese people's professional characteristics have gone through the process of laborers and then researchers, and now they have reached the new elite class. This process, so these images are superimposed on each other. In fact, according to my observation, there is a fourth picture gradually emerging, especially before and after the... This time, there is e-commerce represented, cross-border trade, and even live streaming e-commerce, and real estate investment, and these work related to import and export trade and intermediary. A large number of Chinese engaged in business began to rise gradually in the US. This is what I have observed. It's not shown in the data yet. The image of these Chinese merchants is gradually forming and gradually form for professional images. These professional images, when stacked together, it is the national memory of America. The perception of Chinese professionals is high. Actually, there is another line is worth mentioning. As early as in the 1950s, there was a man named Kwong, who seemed to be Chinese, was elected as a federal senator in the US. This should be the earliest recorded Chinese to serve in a federal level institution. But this was the only case. He was silent for decades. Until 1996, Luo Jiahui was elected as the governor of Washington. In a year or two, there were new senators and congressmen at this level emerged. Then there was state level congressmen one after another. Came out at this level of politicians. That is to say, since the first case in the 1950s to the 1990s until now, some Chinese Americans have gradually entered politics. Although the number is very disproportionate,
because the Chinese in the US are recorded.
Can be counted. Should be 1.522%.
But the representatives with political voice should be at the level of 2000s. The political voice of this ethnicity in the US is still disproportionate, but this is also a good phenomenon because we should understand that it is a multi-ethnic
And multicultural integrated country. In China, actually, it's hard for us to imagine Americans will come to China to be politicians. Do you know? On the contrary, if we think Chin Americans in American politics is also a welcome thing,
gradually enter the political arena. This is also a picture, although the color is still faint.
So you see, I've talked about 5 pictures in total. If an American mentions, when talking about Chinese people, what kind of occupation they do, Americans will superimpose these 5 images to form a new picture. Today, it should be said, the image of Chinese people in the minds of Americans has actually changed a lot. In fact, compared with other ethnic groups in the US, Chinese professional image is not low.
Although in some literary and artistic works.
On TV, there are some funny images, nerds, or poor social skills, some funny situations in this regard. Of course, we know.
They even make fun of their own people.
They laugh at everything. But in terms of the actual image, the image of Chinese people in the workplace. I remember 10 years ago when I went to Silicon Valley, I talked to my good friends in Silicon Valley. The ratio of Chinese to Americans,
now that I think about it, is really a typical new elite ideology.
My friend just said lightly,
but proudly told me that in Silicon Valley, Americans are not rich. But Chinese in Silicon Valley are rich.
Chinese who Silicon Valley have excellent academic qualifications and excellent knowledge and hold important positions with high income.
And my friend also thinks that in the US, in fact, most Chinese in the United States live in this way of life. Only in some very old San Francisco or Los Angeles, there are still some old Chinese communities. Live in some who used to be in the laboring state, continue from the past, such Chinese people. But this proportion is rapidly declining, while the proportion of new elites is increasing rapidly. There is one point that I think we should see. Chinese employment in American society has not been widely presented so far, is still narrow. Labor lawyers, accountants, Silicon Valley elites. I think in this era, the United States, the irreversible integration of closely advancing together. In fact, many business people have shown new professional features, yes, can truly integrate Chinese into American society.
And truly influence American society.
And historical opportunity. I do see that today's Chinese in American society have become more and more. This is a good friend of mine in Los Angeles. When he first went there, he did everything. Airport pickup, delivering things, and even some catering. Now he is doing a stable, and the income is also very good. What is it? Buy old houses and make some renovations and deal with it and then sell it. Originally, this business was only in the Chinese community. Do you understand? In the Chinese community, Chinese buy houses and then sell them to Chinese. That's probably how it goes. My good friend, when he first entered this industry, he was just a young man. I really can't compete with those ants. You can't. These ants got together to raise money and buy a house and renovated it, and they sold it for 10,000 yuan. Houses in the Chinese area. This resource, I really can't compete with them. Then he gritted his teeth and entered the white area. He went to collect houses in white areas, starting with the simplest foreclosure. Some whites couldn't afford the debt, and their houses were seized. You can understand it. Starting with foreclosure, it's been 7 or 8 years. He may have described various scenes to me. We probably know that. If in Los Angeles, most white areas are not as good as Chinese areas. It's relatively messy, relatively poor and backward, and it's hard to get the house. There will be many troubles. For example, people living there won't leave. This is the simplest one. A little more complicated is this house. I finally drove the people out of it. After I took over this house, I was about to decorate. I found a family of homeless people living there. Haha, they won't leave. Almost every house I buy, I always encounter such troubles. He keeps penetrating into the surrounding communities, white communities, Mexican communities, and Indian communities. It involves many different ethnic communities. Truly, to deeply understand the living conditions of Americans. I think this friend has really integrated into America. He is completely integrated into American society, investing in second-hand houses. I think it will be a new career. The picture gradually emerges. More and more Americans will find that Chinese people's talents in business and image in business, this is not only helpful for Americans to know China. It will be very helpful, but also for the Chinese gradually entering the global business, but also good for the economy. Finally, I'll use a Chinese friend who has been working in Los Angeles. Interesting discovery of a Chinese friend to end this topic. He told me that he observed that it was strange that basically. No Chinese people after coming to America. And finally settled down to work. They still do their jobs. They almost all changed careers. He used to do venture capital in China. Now he goes there. He runs a not small logistics company and owns a large number of trucks. He never dreamed of doing this, but he found that everyone around him was like this.
They all changed their careers after going there.
And doing well in it.
So I think
Chinese people really have a new career,
have a new career picture. I'm looking forward to it.
I was very good at math. That's a big Asian stereotype. They never let me use a calculator until I turned 15, so I can work on my brain function. That's an old school Chinese strategy. So when I was 14 years old, I stole my brother's calculator, I stole Roy Rogers' calculator, and I locked myself in my room and I started rebelling. I started doing math homework. Other kids were like around with like alcohol and drugs. I was up some parabolas, you know? Locked myself in a room, I was just punching in numbers. I was like, oh man, this feels great, you know? It's so wrong, it's awesome.